Hey everybody, Scout Crafty here again. It's Mishmash Monday, and boy, today we have a heck of a mosh to get to. So let me start off quickly by saying it's mid-September, and normally at this time for over 20 years, I would just be gearing up. Our first Boy Scout meeting would be held about this time. We would run from September to about June. And when you first started with again, the boys are 11 to 17, so they're also starting school at this time too. So it's important. They're excited. They're looking forward to a new program, and you wanted to give them things that they're going to enjoy, but also you had to give them instruction. They had to learn things from Scouts. So one of the first things we would teach them is first aid. We'd always start off in September with first aid, and then in October we would get into knives, and the boys really enjoyed the knives. Now, real quickly, how it worked is every boy coming into the troop would have a knife and axe instruction, and this was they would receive a certificate, a little card, and it was called a tote and chip card. And with that card, and some of you are probably smiling now because you remember getting it, with this card it entitled you to work in the axe yard or handle a knife or something like that, because you had proper instruction on how to handle a knife and axe. And quick story, I had a friend of mine who back in Scouts, this guy was always kind of rambunctious, and he was always doing things that, you know, he'd be throwing axes at trees and knives or whatever, and not that the leaders back then, you know, not that they, you know, they knew boys would be boys, but eventually one of the axes would find its way just missing one of the leaders, and he'd get all upset and yell at the boy, and he'd say, "All right, give me a tote and chip card." Now, the tote and chip card was square, and how it would work is, if ever you did something that was improper procedure with a knife, or like if you handed a knife to somebody, blade first or something, you would, you know, they'd say, "Give me a tote and chip card," and they'd cut a corner off. And when you had 4 corners taken off, then you would have to get re-instructed before you can use a knife or an axe again. So this guy in Scouts, what happened was every time he'd get like 3 corners taken off, he would trim the whole card, you know, with a scissor so that it was square. And I remember one time, you know, this way you couldn't tell any corners were taken off. So he'd re-square the card more or less. I remember one time one of the leaders, he did something and he said, "Give me a tote and chip card." And this guy handed him, the leader, the tote and chip card, and it was like this big. And it was kind of funny because I think the gig was up at that time. Now, our traditional knife that the Scouts would carry would look something like this. This one here is a nice vintage K-bar. And this one here, it's an 1152 model, and it had, basically you had 4 functions with this. The knife would have a standard blade, you had your can opener, an awl or a punch, and then you had your screwdriver. And if you wanted to, you could count the bottle opener here as a 5th function. But these were your basic knives, and this is what they would carry and learn on and use all the time. Now, in order to keep them excited and things, I would bring in different collections from all over the world. And today I'm going to demonstrate some Swiss knives that everybody would always find fascinating. Now, I'm sure everybody around the world recognizes this knife because they are the world's most popular knives, and these are they call them Swiss Army knives, but they're basically Swiss knives. And these are this one's made by Victorinox, but the other one is Wenger, and those 2 knives make up the majority of the Swiss Army style knives. They've been around for 100 years. They're impeccable quality. This one here has quite a few functions for a small knife. You could see opened up, the Swiss knife has quite a few more functions than the standard Scout knife did, including the Phillips screwdriver, the sewing awl, and also, which everybody gets a kick out of, it has a toothpick in one side. This would be considered a toothpick, and on the other side you have tweezers. And I can tell you one thing, the tweezers did come in handy more than you would think in the field. So these were always interesting knives, and Scouts always got a kick of them. The problem is they weren't really a heavy-duty knife, and the kids would wind up bending these, you know, more than they would a knife that was a little bit more robust, you know. But this was, you'd always see the leaders would always have one of these or something, because they knew the limitations of the knife they were carrying. The Scouts always got a kick out of the multi-function knives, and the more functions, the better it was. Here, this was a high visibility color that they experimented with for a while, and you could see this here is the next step up from the typical Scout knife. It's also a lightweight knife, and it has things such as a scissor and a hook over here, and of course the corkscrew, which always came in handy. How many times did we need a corkscrew? But they found their way onto the knives, and this was like a you know, a second level entry, but then it started to get exciting. Okay, next up we had the slightly impractical but totally cool knives that were offered by both Victorinox and Wenger, and you can see here the difference. These are two different manufacturers, but look at that clear red, and of course, you know, they're red. I wonder why they picked that color in wires. But this one here, you can see here, this one is a clear red scales, and you can see the inner workings of it. But boy, do these have a lot of different functions, you know. I mean, we can go through them here. Look at this one, for example. You know, the corkscrew that we were laughing about. But look what they did, the ingenious device that they put a little watch screwdriver for, you know, your watch inside, and that spins on there and holds it captive. It won't come out. Totally ingenious. Let me show you some of the functions on both. Now, as a young scout coming up through the ranks, you know this would spark your imagination. You say, I got to have one of these. Look at this. Look at all the functions on this thing. To explain all of them, but look, it's even got the fire starter / magnifier. It's got a little pliers here. Again, this one here is a Victorinox. You could see here. It also has, let's see, some other interesting. This one here is interesting. You see here, this is a torque setup, but when you pull out over here, it has all the array of different bits. It has a Phillips bit and large Phillips and other torques, so that's pretty interesting that that's in there. And yeah, and it's got, of course, the fish scaler and the saw and things like this. Now, the Wenger has a little bit different. They operate a little bit different. They still got the magnifying glass. This one here has a protractor with a compass that actually works, and it shows you a whole way of how to use that, including a scale, a map scale. And it has a little wrench here, a little multi-wrench here. Again, with the maybe fish scale or the pliers here. And this one here is like a slip joint plier. You can see how that works. And so, you know, very interesting. Again, limited in what they can do in their scope because of the size, but they are cool. You can't deny that. Now, the Mac Daddy of all the Victorinox, I think they have one bigger than this, but this one was the cat's pajamas. This is the one that I would show. Look at this, huh? This is a totally functional knife. Very pocket friendly, huh? Look at the size of this thing. This has 80 functions, and the kitchen sink is something it doesn't have, but it has almost all the functions I showed before and a few other ones. Like, for example, here is a flashlight. You can see here, it's a flashlight. It also has a, unfortunately, the batteries are dead because this thing's got to be 10 years old or more. It had a clock and you know, other things here that you'd have to change the batteries on. And it had two of these little wrench type functions that also had one here you could see was the Torx bits over here, and the other one here would be your Phillips and screwdriver bits there. That would all go into these two arms. So really interesting. Let me open some of it up. So here we have just half of the, we don't have the bottom half opened up, but it takes you like 5 minutes to open up all these functions. And as you can see, it definitely has a lot of different things that it does. But let me show you some of the interesting things on this one here. It has, like I said, two of these little wrenches, but here's interesting. You see these magnifying glasses? There's two of them. Well, if you put the one down that acts as a telescope, so not just a magnifying glass, but when you have the other one down, you could use it as a telescope. And, you know, saw, nail file. It has a bunch of different blades, and let me tell you, they are scary sharp, so you got to be very careful. Now you know why we do first aid before we do the tote and ship. But this is it. This is the big one. That's something, huh? Would you carry something like this? I don't know. But it is definitely Swiss engineering. You can't beat it. You can't say anything bad about Swiss engineering. You know, those people, they make stuff that is just unparalleled in the world. So that was the... So one of my goals as a scout leader was to bring down so much cool stuff that these kids would never spend a dime on drugs and alcohol because they always wanted the next gadget or gizmo or Swiss Army knife or compass or something, and it really worked out well because they all turned out great. Fine young gentlemen. Okay, next up, okay, we talked about flashlights last time. Let me give you a quick tip. Who remembers these? Oh yeah, the infamous mini mag light. You know, years ago when we were looking for a high quality flashlight, these came out and we all jumped on them because, you know, everybody wanted something that was durable and this says waterproof and everything. These turned out to be the worst pieces of junk ever made. And I'll tell you why. They're, you know, manufacturing is fine, but let me tell you some of the bad downfall. First of all, the bulbs. These things used to come with a, they called it like a Krypton bulb or something. They were rated for 2 hours. So that means that there's a good chance that when you were out in the field doing something, those bulbs would let you down. They say, don't worry, there's one in the cap. Yeah, go change it when it's pitch black. Anyway, this had a focus and things like that, and we were all excited about them. But let me tell you the biggest problem with these lights, and that was every time you went to use it, that's right, corrosion. Because why did these corrode? Because you see that little O-ring gasket? There's your culprit right there. You see, batteries have a tendency to what we call off gas, and that means they release little bits of gas. And when you have an airtight battery compartment like this mini mag light was airtight, plus it was aluminum, and it had that O-ring because they called it waterproof. When you had that, that was a recipe for disaster. So what happened was, when we used to get these lights, this isn't a mag light, thank goodness, but what we would do is, if you were going to store it for a while, you would crack the back. You would just loosen up the back a little bit, because this one too has an O-ring. If you were going to really store it for a long time, get rid of the O-ring altogether. I mean, seriously, how many times do you drop your flashlight in water? So who needs a waterproof flashlight? Especially when this O-ring creates an airtight seal in there, and what happens is it corrodes the battery. So if you're not going to get rid of the O-ring, they're useless. So, or either that, or give it a couple turns to loosen it up to let the compartment breathe. Now, the fact that these mag lights were made to such close tolerances around the batteries, and the fact that they didn't breathe, was one of the major causes of why the batteries went bad and always swelled up and corroded in these. Now, one thing you'll find pretty interesting, if you look at any flashlight that's made by a battery manufacturer, like Energizer, they make this flashlight, right? Look at this flashlight. I mean, it works fine. It's it's a little bigger, but look at this. Now, you won't find any O-rings in their flashlight, and plenty of room to off gas. So you'll never have this flashlight experiencing corrosive and if it does, it won't damage the flashlight whatsoever because there's so much room in there. But there's so much air in there, and there's so much breathing space that's one of the problems. So O-rings are an enemy to our flashlight. Obviously, if you're using your flashlight all the time, or you use recharge, something like that, and you're up to date on your flashlight, you won't have a problem. You know, this is only for ones that you keep in storage, like in the glove compartment, or if you have it in a drawer somewhere. You know, that's where you're going to run into that problem with the batteries not being able to off gas and having room to breathe. Okay, next up, boy, I tell you, this is my good buddy, 357 Magdad. He did a really nice hammer restoration last week, and I think it was like a geology hammer or something. It was and he polished it out, came out beautiful. But the problem was that he had a little problem with the handle splitting. And I thought I would address some of the problems that, now I'm by no means any expert, but I've hung a lot of hammerheads onto handles, and I'll tell you, I've gone through a lot of different problems, and I figured out a lot of what causes it. So let's go deal with just what happened with him. Now, I'll have a link to his video in the description, but this is a miniature version of the hammer he was trying. It had the same kind of shape, you know, and basically what it was a longer, thinner shape profile on the head. And they're pretty difficult to hang, especially because the wedges tend to go past the head of the hammer, which, you know, compared to a larger head, like this one here, look how much space you have here for that wedge to go into and not worry about splitting. But let me tell you why a lot of them do split below the head. Now, here we have two pieces of wood. These are identical because they were cut from the same piece. Now, if I was going to drive a wedge into the top here of these pieces of wood, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think it'll split through? What's your guess? So let's give it a try. I'm going to do this one with this wedge right now. Okay, we're going to take that first piece of wood and we're going to drive the wedge in as it was a hammer handle. And if you notice, the crack is starting to appear already. And I guess you could see what would happen. That's no surprise to any of us. It's split right way down. Now we're going to put this second piece of wood into the vise. Same exact style of wood. And if you look, we're going to look at the grain. We're going to be doing it the same way with the grain. And we're going to just snug it up a little bit in the vise, and we're going to bang it down. And let's see if the results are somewhat different. Now you notice it's splitting, same spot, right? But watch what happens as we drive this through. Keep watching. Now, that's an extreme example, but if you notice, the split ends over here. I'll show you real close. If you look real close, you can see that split doesn't go past the vise. Why is that? Now, if you look here, even when it's taken out of the vise, the split doesn't go all the way through. Why is that? Because it's easily split through this when it was standing alone. It's because there was pressure holding it down, and that's exactly what the hammerhead does, is it holds this together so that there's no room for this to split out. Now, obviously, if the wedge is too long, it is also going to create a problem because it goes below the hammerhead, so you want a shorter wedge when you're dealing with a shorter head. Okay, you can see that these pieces are all split down the middle. Let's try something different. Now I'm taking these split pieces of wood, I'm just placing it back together like this, no glue in it, just squeezing it together. On one of them I put a hose clamp, an industrial hose clamp around the bottom here. You can still see the split, but on the bottom you can see that it's very tight here. You can just barely make out that split there. Now I'm going to reinsert that wedge and see what happens down here at that split. Okay, we reinserted the wedge. You can see it split the wood. That's what the wedge does. It splits it open, widens it, but look below the hose clamp. There's no visible sign of a split. Even though this has already been pre-split, you don't see any sign of a split because the hose clamp is holding it tight. And that's the same thing with a hammer handle. When you bang that hammer handle in from the bottom, it has to be really secure and no gaps from the bottom part. The top is always going to have a little gap, and that's what the wedge does. It opens it up and fills that gap. But the bottom part has to be really secure to stop that split from traveling because it's holding all the fibers together. Anyway, I hope that helps, because that, I believe, will help a lot of people with why they're getting a split below the hammerhead. Okay, everybody, sorry we ran so long on this one. I hope you all have a nice day. Take care now. Bye-bye. Hey, look, free shipping.